Greetings from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clemens Sedmak, and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute, which has been established to build bridges between our university and Europe. Welcome to our online symposium, the US-Austria Peace Treaty at 100, Historical, Political, and Moral Perspectives. We are very grateful to the Bott-Stieber Foundation for its generous support of this event. The Bott-Stieber Foundation was established to promote an understanding of the historic relationship between the United States and Austria. The foundation has been founded by Dietrich Bott-Stieber, who was born in Austria and had to emigrate when the Nazis took power in Austria. He settled in the US to pursue an exceptionally successful career in technical development, but remained connected to Austria and also founded the Bott-Stieber Institute for Austrian American Studies, BIAAS, that promotes an understanding of the historic relationship between Austria and the US, including the lands of the former Habsburg Empire, by awarding grants and fellowships, organizing lectures and conferences, and publishing the Journal of Austrian American History. A big thank you to the Bott-Stieber Foundation. Today, we want to mark the 100th anniversary of the US-Austria Peace Treaty, which was signed on August 24, 1921. This treaty was of great importance for Austria in general and for the US-Austrian relations after the First World War in particular, since it enabled the US government to enter a new quality of collaboration with Austria, but also partially assisting the Austrian government to ease the burden of war reparations imposed in the Treaty of Saint-Germain. We here at the Nanovic Institute are interested in these bridges between the US and European countries. And I have to admit that there may be a slight bias towards Austria in our institute at the moment, since I'm originally from Austria, and my dear colleague, Professor Hildegunde Müller, who is our senior liaison for research and curricular affairs as well. And that is why, as you see, I've put on my Austrian tie this morning. As part of our efforts to commemorate the US-Austria Peace Treaty from 1921, we will also host a visit by the Austrian ambassador to the United States, Martin Weiss. He will be with us here on campus for a talk and a reception on Monday, August 23rd. Ambassador Weiss's talk, entitled Transatlantic Relations, an Austrian Perspective, 1921-2021, will be made available to the public. Today's event is more academic in nature, but not less friendly and not less community building. We want to explore the document of the peace treaty, bringing together scholars from the United States and Europe to shed light on the text and its context. We are particularly interested in what could be called the moral biography of the document. We will collect building blocks for such a biography. Please allow me to briefly explain. One can write the biography of a person, narrating the key aspects of a person's life, including important people, events, beliefs, decisions, actions, and accomplishments. One can also write the moral biography of a person, focusing on the moral dimensions of a person's life. In a certain sense, Hannah Arendt's influential book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, reflects aspects of such an endeavor. One can look at history through a moral lens. My former colleague from King's College London, Jonathan Glover, has written an influential book, Humanity, which was designed as a moral history of the 20th century. That's also the subtitle of this influential book. A moral consideration of historical events offers promising dialogues between historians, moral philosophers, and political scientists. Jonathan Glover, to come back to my example, is a moral philosopher by training and by interest and expertise. The same interest in the moral dimension can be brought to documents. Documents are created in a context and have a history that leads to the document and a history that is shaped by the document. One can write the biography of a document, a story of its life, so to speak. Silvia Celas Garcia has provided a stellar example of this approach in her article, Biography of a Colonial Document, in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Latin American History from 2016, where she explores a document through its creation, travel, and storage, with the particular focus on the colonial context. Donald Mackenzie's 1986 lecture, Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts, can be read as an eloquent plea to increased attention to the social aspects of documentation use and of document use and creation. One can also write a specific type of biography of a document, namely a moral biography. A moral biography of a document is the reconstruction of the moral aspects of the life of a document. A moral biography looks into the genesis of the document, identifying decision-making processes and choices, context and circumstances, arguments and concerns, motivations and desires, voices and stakeholders. It analyzes the actual document from a moral point of view, the language and lacunae, the presumptions and implications, and it explores the political footprint, its dissemination and impact. In other words, a moral biography of a document discusses the value dimension of a document's history and the document's connection to matters of justice and peace. We can ask two simple questions. Which moral concerns have played a role in the creation of the document? And which moral challenges have been created by the text and its many decisions? So, which moral concerns have played a role in the creation of the document? Which moral challenges have been created by the text and its many decisions? The US-Austria Peace Treaty from 1921 lends itself to systematic moral considerations because of its inextricable connection to international and national conflicts. It was signed on August 24, 1921 in Vienna in the aftermath of the First World War. This step was necessary for peace-building purposes since the US Senate refused to consent to the ratification of the multilateral Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919. The reason for the Senate's refusal seems to have been the fact that the Treaty of Saint-Germain included the Covenant of the League of Nations. The concept of a League of Nations was a major point of disagreement between President Wilson on the one hand and the US Senate on the other. The idea of a League of Nations had been burdened from the beginning with the severe peace treaties and the challenge of reparations. These are morally relevant aspects. Categories that have been used to describe President Wilson's politics reflected in the Peace Treaty of Versailles include idealism and utopianism. Again, also these categories are morally relevant. President Wilson was particularly important for Austria's status after the First World War. In his famous address to Congress on January 8, 1918, Wilson proposed a 14-point program for world peace. Point 10 referred to Austria. I quote, "The peoples of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, should be accorded the freest opportunity of autonomous development." End of quote. This was perceived as an emphasis on self-determination and brought hope to Austria, immensely damaged after 3.5 years of war. The literary genre of a peace treaty is also morally relevant and has at least 3 dimensions. It reflects a reading of the past, a power situation of the present, and a view of the political future. The latter is a particularly relevant aspect. To quote Eric Young Lee, "The Americans concluded peace treaties only when they wanted to fundamentally restructure the regional order after the war, or to realize their strategic interest from a broader, longer perspective in some parts of the world." End of quote. In the case of the US-Austria Peace Treaty from 1921, there were specific issues regarding conflicting views of the future of the political organization of the global community, culminating in the above-mentioned conflict about the idea of a League of Nations. And there were also the challenges of what has been called the unfinished peace, created by the peace treaties after World War I. Today's very intimate, very small online symposium will reflect on the US-Austria Peace Treaty by discussing different aspects of the document and its context. We will have an opening keynote delivered by Professor Nicole Phelps from the University of Vermont. And after that, we'll have contributions covering various dimensions of the peace treaty in maybe a more intimate setting. The atmosphere of our small workshop will be friendly and informal. Each contribution will help us better understand aspects of the moral biography of the US-Austria Peace Treaty. We encourage the participants to ask questions through probably the Q&A button. You can also use the chat function. I will try to make sure that we use our Q&A space very well. And at the very end, we will have concluding reflections by our eminent colleague, John Dayak, a historian who specializes in the history of Central Europe with a special interest in the Habsburg Empire. All contributions together will sketch the landscape of the moral biography of the US-Austria Peace Treaty from August 24, 1921. So please allow me to welcome Professor Nicole Phelps. Professor Phelps is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Vermont. She's an eminent scholar with deep expertise on the context that we are discussing today. She's the author of US Habsburg Relations from 1815 to the Paris Peace Conference, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, paperback version in 2015. Nicole has been very gracious and generous in the planning process of this event, so thank you very much for this, Nicole. Professor Phelps' talk is entitled The US-Austrian Treaty of 1921 and the Reconfiguration of Euro-American Relations. Professor Phelps will talk for about 45 minutes, followed by about 15 minutes of Q&A, where I already encourage you to make comments and ask questions. Dear Nicole, I'm very grateful that you're with us today. We're all eager to learn from you. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And let me get my slides set up for you. Okay. All right, so I think hopefully people are able to see my slides and everybody is able to hear me. So, all right.
Good, sounds good, yes.
All right, terrific. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to have an opportunity to think again about this particular treaty and to think about it kind of in more depth than I have for quite some time. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, I wanted to say a bit about the sources that I'm using. And all right, there we go. So I want to definitely stress that what I'm presenting today is not based on truly exhaustive research. The conference kind of came together quickly. I'm working on another project. And so I'm kind of limited in what I'm was looking at. Part of it I'm drawing from my book, which was very much focused on sources that were from the Department of State and the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Ministry. So very much kind of high-level bilateral documents. Also for today, I'm looking at the texts of the treaties themselves. I say treaties because there's more than one that's going to be actually relevant here. But primarily, I'm drawing on coverage from the New York Times, which is the paper of record in the United States. In the 1920s, it was kind of really the paradigm of professional journalism in the United States. It leaned Republican for the time, which Republicans and Democrats were quite different from how we think of them today. At the time, we should think of the Republicans as the party of capital, but a lot of issues, including foreign policy issues, were split across party lines. So the New York Times does lean internationalist in this time period. And also I wanted to mention that I'm very much going to be focused on the United States today, in part because of what records were available to me, but also because in shaping the US-Austrian treaty, the United States very much was kind of in a position of greater power than the Austrians. But I really want to stress that this is not exhaustive, and there are plenty of topics, plenty of sources, both primary and secondary, that can be explored as people are trying to understand the US-Austrian relationship. Okay, so one other important kind of introductory concept to make sure that we're all on the same page here. We have to keep in mind where the United States fit legally into World War I. Of course, so we know we have the Entente, or the Allied powers, which included the French, the British, the Russians. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, they're fighting against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. And the United States joined the war in 1917, and they were very specific in calling themselves an associated power. So they were not fully part of the Allies. They wanted to maintain really a particular kind of moral high ground, but also an ability to act unilaterally. And for today's talk, it's particularly important to keep in mind that the United States only declared war against Germany and against Austria-Hungary. So that declaration of war with Germany came on April 6th, 1917, and the declaration against Austria didn't come until the end of the year, December 7th. And that was largely a result of the way that the Allied and associated powers were doing military planning, and also the kind of integration of the some of the Austro-Hungarian forces into the Western Front. So it was possible for Americans to be actually engaged militarily against the Austrians, and so a declaration of war was important. Sorry, I just needed to change a setting in my Zoom here, and now that made life better. Okay. All right. So the US is only at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And so I'm very much going to be setting aside any discussion of how the Bulgarians and the Ottomans and their Turkish successors played into the larger peace settlement. But I do need to keep talking about the unavoidable, Germany. So the way that especially the big four, Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando, were thinking at the Paris Peace Conference, and then the way that the US government was talking about the peace settlement, they're very much thinking about Germany. And a little bit, they're thinking about Austria, and a teeny bit, they're thinking about Hungary. And sometimes they're thinking about the three countries as a package, but more often what we're seeing is text that's written with Germany in mind is then applied to Austria and Hungary with a little bit of modification as necessary. And so that means, as we're talking about peace between the United States and Austria, we really need to be talking about the Treaty of Versailles, which is the main text that is then adapted for the Treaty of Saint-Germain and the Treaty of Trianon. And again, the other thing I should have said, I don't speak French and I'm an American, so you'll have to excuse my horrible pronunciation of things. I'm not quite as egregious as it's possible for an American to be, but I still say Saint-Germain. Okay, so this emphasis on Versailles and Germany and then modifying it for Austria and Hungary is also the same thing that happens to those 1921 peace treaties between the United States and those countries. And certainly one of the things that happens in the United States is that in the Senate and also in the House, it's Germany that's being debated, policy towards Germany. And often there's very little or no discussion at all of Austria and Hungary. Okay, so if the Treaty of Versailles is so important in all of this, we need to understand Versailles in order to understand the 1921 US-Austrian Treaty. The Treaty of Versailles is long and complex. It runs to more than 500, or sorry, almost 500 articles with several annexes that bring the numbers up even higher. It makes it a treaty that's very different from much of the treaties that were ratified in the previous century, which tended to be much shorter. It is shorter and less complex than a lot of treaties that came later in the 20th century, but it is quite different from previous 19th century treaties. It's also doing a lot. This is not just about peace with Germany. It is a whole framework for European-based international relations, how the world is going to work after the war. And I want to stress that it's European-based. It's coming from that European-focused tradition of territorial sovereignty and international law. That was a system that the United States and Japan and Latin American governments had joined kind of very shortly before World War I started. And it's different from how those powers, Europeans, would interact with other parts of the world. So this is not a system that's really going to apply to everyone. So what's in the Treaty of Versailles? I just want to mention kind of the basic divisions of the treaty and highlight a couple of things about those contents. A preamble is, of course, standard. And then, of course, what's most famous about the Treaty of Versailles is its opening section, which is the Covenant of the League of Nations. So this was explaining how governments were supposed to interact, how they were supposed to solve problems after the war. So this is kind of a precursor to the United Nations. And it also explains how the mandate system is going to work, which is basically European tutelage of colonial governments in order to help move them over time towards independence. The second section is the boundaries of Germany. The third is political clauses for Europe. And between the two of those, they are really setting out what the countries of Europe are, what the sovereign governments are. And that is, of course, redrawing the map. Germany is losing territory. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is being broken up into several different states. We also have a section on German rights and interests outside of Germany. So this is what's going to happen to German colonies and other possessions overseas, as well as kind of more arguments about influence. So like their role in influencing Morocco and influencing China, those kind of interests. We also have military, naval, and air clauses that are restricting the size of the German military going forward. We have information about prisoners of war and graves, how those are supposed to be protected, how prisoners of war are supposed to be treated and returned. Then, of course, we have the penalties section. This sets up war crimes tribunals, including for Germany. There's supposed to be one for the former emperor. Very important, section 8, the reparations section. The main thing I want to point out here is that this sets up the reparations commission. So while there is a lot of detail in the Treaty of Versailles about specific things that Germany needs to pay or give, like how many sheep and how many telephone poles they need to give to the French, it also sets up this reparations commission, which is going to meet after the treaty is signed in order to figure out exactly how much the Germans are supposed to pay and when and how. And so it's going to be kind of an after the fact sort of thing. Then we have financial clauses, which includes a lot of different things, but in particular, it includes how the Germans are supposed to pay the costs for the Allied armies that are occupying the Rhineland. The treaty also has economic clauses, and arguably this is really important in terms of how the Treaty of Versailles is going to sort of bridge the pre-war and the post-war international legal system. Because what the economics clause section does for a lot of it is actually to mention specific treaties that were in force prior to the war and explain that this new German government is responsible for continuing to comply with those treaties. And so it also helps regularize the successor states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now they're all going to be signatories. The Treaty of Versailles also includes aerial navigation, which basically gives the Allies the right to use German airspace. And so this is an important kind of initial setup for how air travel is going to operate in Europe. We have sections on ports, waterways, and railroads, so allowing for use of German rivers, all sorts of things that are designed to keep trade going and setting precedents and rules for allowing freer trade within Europe. Also, there's the creation of the International Labor Office, which is designed to be this multinational institution that's supposed to protect the rights of workers. The German treaty includes a guarantee section. This is that the Allies are going to occupy the Rhineland for a specific amount of time. That is the one section that the treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon don't have. And then finally, we just have miscellaneous provisions, which is kind of other legal agreements, including the neutrality of Switzerland, that they want to inscribe into the new post-war system. Okay. And then it's signatures and maps. And so the treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon have the exact same sections. As much of the language as can be repeated verbatim is, and then it's modified a little bit more for those particular countries' specific circumstances. Okay, so it's doing a lot, very lengthy treaty explaining lots and lots of different things, setting up how international relations in Europe is supposed to work after the war. Okay, and so as you know, for the United States, President Wilson was in Paris for the 6 months of the negotiations from January to June of 1919. So he's there directly. He was also accompanied by approximately 1,000 other Americans who made up the American Commission to Negotiate Peace. That's a few of the most important ones here in the picture, but really there are nearly 1,000 people who are participating on various committees. But amongst those 1,000 people are no Republicans from the Senate. And that's a problem because, of course, in order for a treaty to be ratified in the United States, the president and the executive branch, they're the ones who negotiate, they're the ones who initially sign, but then ratification requires a 2/3 vote from the Senate before then those ratifications can be exchanged again by the executive and the treaty proclaimed. So Wilson was not working to get those Senate Republicans on board, and this turned out to be a particular problem, especially because in the 1918 elections that happened right before the peace conference, the Democrats and the House, and they lost control of the House and the Senate for the first time in all of Wilson's administration. So Wilson is coming into the second half of his second term, so his fourth Congress, with a hostile Senate, a hostile House, and not only are they hostile, but Wilson, through his entire presidency, has been used to dealing with Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate. So the Senate, after the treaty is signed, the Senate has 3 ratification votes. First, they vote on November 19th, 1919, for a version of the treaty that has reservations, so things that the Senate has changed. And in particular, the Senate was looking to kind of make sure that Congress's role in setting the boundaries of US foreign policy was preserved. And they voted again that day. After they didn't get the 2/3 that they needed, they voted again for a clean version of the treaty, so without all of those reservations. And that didn't pass either. Then, of course, Wilson goes on a speaking tour to try and drum up popular enthusiasm for the treaty, and a vote is held once again on March 19th, 1920, and again, it doesn't get the requisite votes. So when the Senate is arguing about the Treaty of Versailles, there's really a lot that's at stake. They're arguing about the future of US foreign policy. Is the United States going to be, engaged in the League of Nations? Is it going to be active? Or is it going to try and stick closer to the traditional foreign policy of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson that stresses staying out of politics in Europe, no entangling alliances, but also allows for pursuing economic interests? So there's that. There's also a big fight over the treaty about the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Wilson, even though he was a constitutional scholar, he seems to have forgotten a lot about what Congress would actually need to approve. When Wilson signed the Treaty of Versailles, he's not really thinking about the fact that Congress needs to fund the military if it's going to be deployed, not really thinking about the fact that the Senate has the right to advise on treaties, that it has the right to confirm appointees. So there's all sorts of those kind of issues. And then another thing that makes this all challenging is that a lot of these debates about these really serious issues don't line up with party lines. So we do have that kind of standard, Democrats and Republicans like to argue with each other. But what's happening here is that you have both Democrats and Republicans who are in favor of the League. You have both Democrats and Republicans who are not. And so it's difficult to think about the politics of getting something passed because it definitely involves kind of more alliances, more politicking. There really isn't a clear majority anywhere. There's people who are kind of up for grabs. So, okay, we have a United States that has rejected the Treaty of Versailles, but the rest of the world hasn't. And so this new system that Versailles is putting in place is moving forward. Not only, of course, do we have the Treaty of Versailles, which goes into effect in January of 1920. We have the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria, which is in effect in July of that year, and the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, which is following later, but is also kind of part of this system. And what's really important is that once these treaties are ratified by people other than the United States, we have a switch from a peace conference of allied and associated powers that's now morphing into a set of other institutions. The plenary session of the Paris Peace Conference becomes the General Assembly of the League of Nations. So we have the League that's doing things, and the US is not a member of that. We have the Reparations Commission coming out of the treaty, but the United States is not a member of that because they haven't ratified the treaty. They have an unofficial observer. And then there's all sorts of other allied conferences of ambassadors, of prime ministers, of military officials that are all still meeting, but the United States is involved in some of them, but not others. And so it's all just very complicated. And the US is in a really strange position because they're still an associated power, but they're not a member of the League. And so there's really kind of two particularly big problems for the United States in this unusual position. One of them is about what US rights are going to be in the new League of Nations mandates. And for purposes of our discussion today, what's important is those former German overseas possessions. Those have become League mandates. And so, for example, Japan has a mandate over the island of Yap in the Pacific, where there was a German cable station. And the Americans are arguing that as Americans, as victors in the war, that they should have a right in deciding what happens to that property, even though it's a League mandate now. So there's this tension between whether the League is really in control or whether the US should be involved because they were part of the winning coalition of the war. So there's that. And the Wilson administration has that problem, and it's continued on in the Harding administration. There's also a problem because of the different kinds of money and property that are in play amongst different countries. And there's four main kinds. One is claims. This is the property of private citizens that was seized or sequestered during the war. And that would be a normal kind of thing. Throughout the conflicts of the 19th century, this kind of action would happen. And so Americans and everybody else expect there to be claims at the end of a war. And in the United States, most of this is kind of governed under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And then the person who's actually in charge of administering all of this is the alien property custodian. A second category here is war debts. So this is money that was loaned to other governments for the conduct of the war. The United States, of course, is the major creditor to the Allies. And so the United States is interested in getting that money back. A third category, of course, is reparations. These are this is money or property that would need to come from the former Central Powers in order to make the victors whole. It's covering things that are costs to the government, like veterans' pensions and all sorts of other costs. And the treaties attach a moral claim to this. It's Article 231 in the Treaty of Versailles, 177 for Saint-Germain and 161 for Trianon, that's kind of shorthand known as the war guilt clause, that's saying that part of the reason why the Germans, the Austrians, the Hungarians need to pay these things is because they are responsible for the war. This whole reparations thing is much more innovative. It's new in World War I, and so it's much more controversial, especially because it has this moral element. And so the Americans are less keen on this. And finally, there are relief payments, relief money, or relief goods. This is charitable aid. It can be actual food or clothing, or it can be credits for those things. And for the United States, the American Relief Administration is set up in February 1919 to deliver relief to Europe. Herbert Hoover is heading this. So we have these four different categories, and allies, not the US, but the allies, the former Central Powers and the new successor states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, they all have incentives to sort of blend those four categories. And in particular, a willingness to use claims, the property that was seized from private citizens, to use that to pay war debts or reparations. And the Reparations Commission is helping this process along because they keep meeting, they're attuned to the politics, they're constantly renegotiating what's supposed to be happening. The United States does not like this mixing. They want to keep these four categories separate, and they want to defend property rights in general, but they also are wanting to distance themselves from reparations. Often you'll see Americans arguing that Germany shouldn't have to pay reparations. It would be better for everybody if the German economy could just go back to normal and buy American products. Okay, so these are these kind of two big issues that the US is grappling with: mandates and these different kinds of property claims. So with all of these concerns in mind, plus the fact that the Senate needs to end a state of war so they can end various wartime domestic legislation in the United States, and they want to be able to resume trade and diplomacy with Germany and Austria and Hungary. So when the third vote on the Treaty of Versailles fails, what we get is the proposal of the Knox Resolution. This is by Senator Philander Knox, a Republican of Pennsylvania. And so he introduces this resolution that would repeal the 1917 declarations of war. And at the same time, it would also claim the rights and privileges that are due to the United States from the armistice that ended the fighting, and then also from the Treaty of Versailles. So even though the United States isn't actually signing the Treaty of Versailles, he's trying to hold on to what rights the US would have. Wilson hates this. It does pass both the Senate and the House, but mostly it passes the House so that Wilson can veto it, and it can kind of take this off the table as a potential solution. So Wilson does veto this on May 27th, 1920. The following day, there's an attempt to override the veto, but there are not enough votes for that. And so the United States is still at war. The Senate doesn't have a treaty to consider at this point because after they voted against it 3 times, they sent it back to Wilson. And so on June 5th, 1920, Congress adjourns, and they're not due to come back until after the November election. That election, November of 1920, the treaty is very much a campaign issue. The candidates are Warren G. Harding, who is the Republican, and James Cox, who is the Democrat. Harding had been in the Senate. He voted for the Knox Resolution, and he's running his campaign very much as if he were running against Wilson as opposed to Cox. So it's very much about the treaty and foreign policy. And in fact, both Harding and Cox kind of waffle about their position on the League of Nations and about many other things. But on election day, Harding wins big. He wins a little over 60% of the popular vote. This is a huge margin. It's like 26 points. And so not only does Harding have this strong popular mandate, but also the Senate and the House both become strongly Republican, clear majorities in both houses. So we have a lame duck Congress. So these are not the people who were elected in November of 1920. It's the last session of the people who were elected in 1918. So it's this lame duck Congress that meets between December 6th and March 4th, 1921, and they don't really do anything with peace. But right before the inauguration of Harding, which inaugurations are still in March at this point, they do pass legislation on March 2nd, which Wilson signs on March 3rd, that ends a lot of the wartime legislation in the United States. Still doesn't actually end the war, but shuts down a lot of those legislative actions. So then we have the new administration, the Harding administration. Harding is president, his Secretary of State is Charles Evans Hughes. There's a lot of mystery at the beginning about what their position is about all sorts of things. Are they going to resubmit the Treaty of Versailles to the Senate? Are they going to try and pursue a separate peace? If they do pursue a separate peace, will there be some other sort of commitment to the Allies? In particular, will they guarantee French borders? nobody knows. And nothing really happens until early April, when we finally get a speech, public speech from Harding, where he is kind of setting out the basics of his foreign policy. The New York Times describes it as what they consider to be independent lines, but on a broad basis of virile and friendly Americanism, which, in other words, they're trying to split the difference between keeping a unilateral US foreign policy and also trying to signal to their European allies that they're not going to completely abandon Europe. And it's a fine line because the preponderance of interest in the US is on that unilateralism. The next day, Hughes writes a note to the League of Nations on the mandate issue, expressing the opinion of the United States. He was invited to attend the League meeting when that was being discussed, but he's not allowed to attend because the Senate has prevented Americans from officially representing the United States at the League. So that's his statement of policy. And so he's trying to work behind the scenes to get that accepted. And then I also want to mention that their ally in the Senate is Henry Cabot Lodge, who's the Republican chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so he is very close with the administration and in control of how things move through committee. Okay, so now that they are back in session, Congress is back in session, we get a revised version of the Knox Resolution introduced in the Senate. This one is revised so that it treats Germany, Austria, and Hungary all the same way in the same resolution. And the Senate approves that in April of 1921. And then it's a resolution. It's going to be a joint resolution. So the Senate and the House both need to agree on it. The House has the resolution, but they're sitting on it because the administration wants them to. The administration is trying to have those negotiations about the mandates. The administration is trying to organize what's going to be the Washington Naval Conference happening later that year, really kind of as an alternative to the League of Nations. And so the US, the Harding administration wants to keep this sort of sense of unresolved Treaty of Versailles situation in order to use that for leverage on these other things that matter to them. When the House does act, we get an alternative resolution. This is called the Porter Resolution from Stephen Porter, who's the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee. And this one is a little bit different than the Knox Resolution because it doesn't repeal those declarations of war. It instead declares peace. There's a whole big discussion about whether repealing the declarations would be Congress admitting that it made a mistake when it entered the war, and Congress does not want to make a mistake. So this is an alternative for the idea of declaring peace. And also, because it looks like this joint resolution is probably how the United States is going to get out of the war, the State Department and the alien property custodian have weighed in on a lot of technical details that they think are necessary in order to have this be successful. So the Porter Resolution includes those things. And so there's a conference committee between the Senate and the House to agree on these things. And so we end up with the Knox-Porter Resolution that declares peace, includes Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and all of these details from the alien property custodian. This passes on July 1st, 1920 by significant majority in both the House and the Senate. People do vote against it. Why do they vote against it? Some of it is kind of partisan grasping at straws. They're saying that the armistice was sufficient. They're saying the president could just proclaim the end of the war. And those are not particularly legally sound arguments. Other people vote against it because they want the United States to actually sign the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. And then the other position is that this is not a good choice because now the United States and Germany and Austria and Hungary are negotiating as equals rather than as the victor and the vanquished. And some people in the House and the Senate don't want to give up that power. So it passes. And then the next day it goes to the president, Harding, who's on vacation in New Jersey. He signs the Knox Resolution, which we'll now refer to as the July Resolution, in between rounds of golf at his friend, Senator Freilinghuisen's house in Raritan, New Jersey. The New York Times actually had a lot to say about what Harding was wearing when he did this. And he's in fact wearing a red and green bow tie. So it's very Hungarian patriotic, although I really doubt that he thought about that when he was putting on his clothes that day. But anyway, so these are the Frelinghuysen children and wives who were kind of there on vacation as well. So this is signed. What now? Well, does there need to be a proclamation of peace from the president? Do we need new treaties? They don't really know. The New York Times puts it quite well. Now that the resolution is signed, no one in authority seems to know what it means. And that's really true. The president sends the attorney general off to investigate about what might need to happen next. The big problem here is that there's not uniformity of language in the various laws and orders. And so some of them say like, this lasts until peace is declared. Some others say this lasts until the war ends. There's all sorts of variations, and so it's not clear. Things go pretty quiet as they're investigating this, as nobody knows what the heck is going on. We do get about 3 weeks later, in July, there's an article in the New York Times where we find out that there are negotiations going on in Berlin. And I've highlighted, admission was made today in official quarters. And the whole sense of the coverage, like that, ooh, we didn't want to tell you about this, but you found out, that is what's going on with the Harding administration here. They're doing these negotiations secretly. The issue comes up again in August, the 10th of August. There's a pithy exchange on the floor of the Senate where senators are asking Lodge what's going on. He doesn't know. And so then quiet. And then all of a sudden, there's new treaties. The New York Times tells us that the treaty with Austria was signed in Vienna on the 24th of August, with Germany and Berlin on the 25th of August, with Hungary and Budapest on the 31st of August. And the text of the Austrian and Hungarian treaties are withheld. There's some concern about wanting them to be ratified in Austria and Hungary without a lot of public discussion. So that's why they're keeping things under wraps there. But the text with Germany is released on the 25th of August. And the State Department just tells people, yeah, it's pretty much the same, except Austria and Hungary and Saint-Germain and Trianon instead of Germany and Versailles. So we have these new treaties that are signed. Also, I want to mention that the same day the Hungarian treaty is signed, we have a court decision in the US that says that July resolution did not end the Trading with the Enemy Act. So more action is definitely going to be needed. So what do these treaties do? If they all basically say the same thing, what do they do? The preamble is basically the whole text of the July resolution, where they are declaring peace and also insisting that they still have all of the rights from the armistice and the treaties. And that's specified in Article 1. And I just want to highlight part of the language here. All the rights and advantages stipulated for the benefit of the United States in the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which the United States shall enjoy, notwithstanding the fact that such treaty has not been ratified by the United States. So this is very much kind of a having your cake and eating it too, where they're not going to ratify those treaties, but they're going to get everything that they want out of them. And then Article 2 goes on to specify which parts of the Treaty of Saint-Germain the US has in mind. And so I've listed all of the parts of the Treaty of Saint-Germain, but the ones in white are the ones that the Americans are agreeing to. So you can see that they're not doing the multilateral things. They're not doing the League of Nations. They're not doing the International Labor Office. And here, they're also not doing borders and political clauses. Allegedly, they're not doing those. But by the fact that the United States is signing treaties with the successor states, they really are recognizing the sovereignty of those countries. So they really are kind of affirming those clauses, even though they're saying that they're not. And finally, the treaty also includes the idea that the United States can participate on the Reparations Commission, but it doesn't have to. So again, this is a treaty where the United States is trying to get a lot without really supporting the whole system overtly. The Austrians ratified the treaty quite quickly in early September of 1921. And then the Senate and the Reichstag were both on recess. They come back in late September, and that's when the Senate debate starts again. Lodge is running things. He gets a guarantee of a vote by October 15th because they're going to limit debate in particular ways. He's trying to get this done before the Washington conference happens. And so that actually gives the Democrats a reason to stall so that the administration looks bad, even though the Democrats can't actually override the debate. The debate, well, so in the Senate, things go smoothly pretty much. In the committee, they go smoothly. On the floor, when they're debating, there's tons and tons and tons of debate. Again, you have people who want to join the League. One of the senators from Texas saying, in not joining the League, we emphasize our desertion of humanity. There are other people who hate the League. This guy who calls it that body of death. I'm actually not sure what his logic is for that, but he has no problem calling it that. And then you have somebody like William Borah, who is very much opposed to any kind of alliances. And he's arguing that the Germans don't actually control the rights that the treaty is trying to get in place here. And in order to know what those rights are, the United States would actually have to sit down with the Allies to figure that out. And Borah is even opposed to that conversation. Sitting down with them is, quote, practically an alliance with these foreign governments. So he has a very low threshold for what constitutes an alliance. Okay, so this is ratified. It's a 66-20 vote for both Germany and Austria. You can see the other treaties also pass. Again, Austria and Hungary kind of being pushed down to the bottom of all of this. And the ratifications are exchanged shortly thereafter, first with Austria, then with Germany, and then Hungary about a month later. So once the ratifications are exchanged, the treaties enter into force, and we have a proclamation from Harding that's just about the treaty with Germany. And what's fascinating about this is what he says is that the war was over on July 2nd. So even though courts and lots of people have said that the July resolution wasn't enough to do anything, Harding is sort of retroactively saying, yes, it was. So we have that, and then there's another proclamation that does the same thing for Austria shortly thereafter. And this paves the way for legations to reopen in US legations in Berlin and Vienna and Budapest. Those happen for Austria in December of 1921. That's when the Austrian legation in Washington opens again. And in February of 1922 is when the US appoints official chiefs of mission at the level of envoy to Austria and Hungary and an ambassador for Germany. And I know I'm just about out of time. I want to say one more thing. I'd like to say that that's the end of the story, but it's really not, because the claims, those private property claims, were not resolved. What the treaties did was like say we're going to have a commission that's going to resolve those. And the United States had 90 days to set up those commissions, and they let the time elapse, which means they had to go and renegotiate all new treaties. Plus, the Congress starts acting on its own. And I'm just going to flip through this really quickly here. But what happens is that the German has its own claims commission. Austria and Hungary have a tripartite claims commission. And it takes so long to actually get Congress to agree to the results of the German ones that the Austrian and Hungarian ones finish up and they all get united again. And it's not until February of 1928 that Congress passes the laws that would release the alien property. And the story ends in August of 1929, when the Secretary of the Treasury sends Austria a check for a little over $1 million to settle those claims. So arguably, that's the end of the war, August 1929. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to questions and discussions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you so much. It was such a great tour through the history and milestones towards the treaty and beyond. I erroneously said you should use, dear audience, the Q&A button. That was wrong. It's a Zoom format, much more informal. So please use the electronic hand raise sign, or put something in the chat. If you have any questions or comments, we would welcome that. Nicole also suggested some questions we could ask her. And may I start with a question on the moral dimensions of these things? So these are, let's keep the slide here. I mean, let's keep the slide here, Nicole, then we can see suggested questions. But may I ask you a question from a moral perspective? So of course, you're a historian and you know what you're doing. I'm not a historian, I'm a moral philosopher, and I'm really interested in those moral dimensions. So if you were to judge from a moral perspective the dynamics of the non-ratification and then the Knox Resolution and then the lack of agreement, where would you see major moral challenges? Or to put it bluntly, do you think that the non-ratification through the Republicans in the Senate was morally wrong or morally right?
So I think there's two things going on here. I think there's a lot of people, both Democrats and Republicans, who would like to be involved in the League in some way, would like to be involved in helping the rest of the world. And so I think that's the more morally defensible position. Yeah. There's other people who really want to, to be unilateral, and there is a morality in that, in the sense of like, not try and control other people's lives. Yep. But where I think there's a problem here is one of the other things that's happening in this period is that Austria is trying to secure a loan, and like they need the League of Nations to like help save the Austrian economy, and the Americans have to agree to forgive a $24 million relief credit for that to happen.
Yeah.
And the Americans don't for like almost 2 years. And it's not because they're saying no, it's because they're not paying attention. Like it's not getting to the right people to actually make a decision. And that is people not doing their jobs effectively. And when your job is to have good relations with other people, then I think that's a pretty serious failing.
Got it. Thank you, Nicole. We have a question from Professor Gunda Bartz-Kalmani from the University of Innsbruck. Gunda, please don't forget to unmute yourself. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you to Nicole Phelps first for your lecture, especially the part highlighting the Treaty of 1921 and the claims procedure after that. I would like to ask you something which I'm asking nearly all US colleagues, and then I have a smaller private question to finish. So my first question is, sorry, I think I did not switch on my video.
Here we go.
My first historical question is, when Wilson proclaimed in January 1918 the right of self-determination, did he have any clear knowledge about the mingled ethnic settlement in many parts, not just of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, but also in other countries? And the second private small question is, can it be that we met in the 1990s at Innsbruck University? Thanks.
No, I don't think so, because I was not an academic yet, and I didn't study abroad in Innsbruck. I studied abroad in Vienna. But as for what Wilson, or really any of his, the advisors that he chose knew, that's something that I really do treat at length in my book. And no, like they're very committed to the kind of racialist science and geography at the time, where they really see culture as being biological. And there's no place in that logic for people to speak more than one language. And of course, people in Austria-Hungary spoke tons of different languages, and we have all sorts of scholarship that tells us that. So like they're really not understanding the nature of people in Central Europe. And because they've closed down the diplomatic channel, like there's no Austrian ambassador in the United States after 1915, there's no good way for the Habsburg government to try and communicate that reality. The people who have the ear of Wilson and his chosen advisors from Central Europe are people who are advocating the new racial national states, and they're specifically pitching it in the kind of terms that Wilson wants to hear.
Thank you, Nicole. You have not met Gunda because you spent time in Vienna, but maybe you have met our next question asker, Professor Peter Becker from the University of Vienna. Peter, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicole, for this great presentation. And I would like to pick up, I already put it down into the chat, but I think it's, as we are more in a familiar setting, I think it's much better to ask it in this way. I would like to address kind of part 3 of the questions that you suggested to be asked. And these are actually 2 ones that I would be curious about. The one is, it's actually how much of the Habsburg monarchy was in this media coverage and in these political debates about the treaty with the First Republic. One particular issue that came to my mind was that the scandal with the last ambassador Dumba. Was this in any way kind of still present in the mind of people in politics or in the media? And the second is, that is something that I came across very much in the Austrian press, this idea that it's this, this kind of significant cultural heritage that Austria, that meaning mainly the Habsburg monarchy, represented, had an impact on America and attracted America to, in a sense, their good deeds and hopefully also good deeds for the future. So I'm just asking, is this present in this discussion, especially in the media, in the New York Times?
Right. So I definitely didn't see anything about Domba, like he's, you know, especially, I mean, by the time we're in 1921, we're in the Harding administration. So lots and lots of stuff has happened since then. And that wasn't part of the discussion, because in fact, actually things that happened much more recently or that are happening during the treaty discussion don't actually really seem to intersect with the treaty discussion. And so like one of the, I think Hungary is actually benefiting a lot from this disconnect, because in the New York Times, Hungary essentially gets blamed for Emperor Karl's attempt to regain the throne. They get blamed for the occupation of the Burgenland, which the New York Times very quickly realizes that they need to stop calling that piece of land West Hungary because it's supposed to be East Austria. And so, you know, then they switch to the Burgenland. But like all of that is on Hungary. And when people are talking about treaties, they're like never actually talking about Hungary. Hungary's benefiting from that big Germany and the slightly bigger Austria. So there's that. There are a bunch of correspondents who are writing different kinds of sort of state of Austria pieces, where they're kind of hearkening back to these different kind of ideas of nostalgia, of artistic contributions. They're very patronizing. And they're like, they tend to be more of the, like nothing is ever actually serious in Austria nature. Like that's the stereotype that they're playing on. And like I did see one really pithy thing from the New York Times where they're like invoking the high culture, but what they do is they say that the United States needs to forgive this debt so that the League can put forward this plan, or otherwise Austria is going to end up like its most famous composer Mozart in a potter's field. They're using kind of stereotypical references and not really engaging with other topics that they could engage with.
Thank you, Nicole. I have a comment from Kurt who wants to reply to Gunda. Kurt, please. Kurt, you are muted, maybe? Kurt, you're still muted. If you want to reply to Gunda, you can do that now.
I'm trying to, okay, now it works, okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I think that was an interesting question Gunda asked, and I think Nicole would confirm that I would like to add that the inquiry plays an important role in this respect. Wilson actually had no idea. I agree with what Nicole said, but in order to correct that, to adjust this ignorance, so to speak, and there was no ambassador, of course, in Washington, neither in Vienna since the breakup of the relations. So Wilson asked Colonel House to install the inquiry, and the inquiry was sort of a think tank. So the think tank and the Austrian group, Austrian subgroup, was led by Charles Seymour. And there's a famous remark that you can read about Charles Seymour. He was a nice historian, a professor, when he told I think it was Lippmann, that he doesn't have any idea about Austria-Hungary. Then he said, no, it was Baumann, sorry. And Baumann said, well, get yourself learned about it and become an expert. So that was a sort of information Wilson or House and then Wilson got from the inquiry. But it was a decent try and effort to get some information. Austria was not present in the United States at the time. Gustav Mahler was conducting at the New York opera house, but we were not present, as a matter of fact. So I think that should be added, that Wilson could not know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Yes, Nicole?
Just say that, so when I said Wilson and his chosen advisors, by chosen advisors, I meant the inquiry, and they, again, they're very wrapped up in the science of the time, which tends to run more anecdotal than actually empirical. And yes, like the guy who knows the most about the Habsburg lands was a recent PhD who wrote his dissertation about the second partition of Poland, which is the one that Austria wasn't involved in. So there's a lack of practical knowledge and an embrace of the scholarship when the scholarship is problematic.
Thank you, Nicole. Let us take a very last question, maybe then a brief reply. Anastasia, please, you raised your hand.
Thank you so much. I suppose you will be able to see me in a second.
We can see you and hear you, yes.
Lovely, great. Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. And I would like to ask probably a provocative question from the Soviet corner of the world, because on the one hand, we do have a brilliant case of slightly later epoch of a non-existent peace treaty between the Soviet Union and Japan from the Second World War, with this beautiful joint declaration, which is octroyed by the US and as good as non-existent so far because of the islands. And the whole case gains its own dynamics with each particular part of the non-existent treaty aiming at its own profits, not reaching them, and thus octroying the whole process of the peace treaty. In this case, with the Austria, we do obviously have one party which has a very different power potential than the other one. Guess which one I'm meaning by that, and is obviously much more interested in the peace treaty than the other party. But probably first of all, I would like you to formulate on that. So my personal impression from your presentation was that basically the Americans forgot about the peace treaty because they couldn't care less about the Austrians at the moment. And then it was probably just a matter of this legalist incongruency that you just have to wash over because the chapter has to be closed. Something like this. It is a very rough formulation, but it looks like this. And the second thing, considering the public discourse on the peace treaty, I would be very much interested in how far there is some sort of a sentiment about the longevity and the life prognosis of the Austrian First Republic, because what you do have in the Soviet discourse of this first decade of post-World War I is that even the encyclopedia, the first edition of the Soviet encyclopedia, for example, writes on the inevitable death of the First Republic in Austria, which is kind of painful to read from the Austrian perspective, but it is there. It is like, this is a truncated state, it will never survive. And this stands basically and is reproduced in the public discourse at the time. I can imagine that this is not the case in the American case, but still I would like you to comment on that, in how far there are any prognosis about it making or not making sense of making a peace treaty with the Austrian Republic back then. Thanks.
Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you. Thank you. Nicole, please, briefly.
Yeah, so I think it actually is to Austria's benefit in some extent to be wrapped up with the German discussions here, because they got a treaty because because the United States knew it needed a treaty with Germany, then like, oh yeah, we can do Austria and Hungary too. So in that sense, benefit. On the question of like, do we think Austria is doomed to fail from the US perspective? No, I mean, I think so there's discussion of like in the press based on European discussions. There's discussions about Austria joining Italy. There's discussions about Austria joining Bavaria. There's discussions about Austria joining the German Empire. And the initial, like around the time the treaty is signed, the Americans are mostly saying, why can't you just get along with the former successor states of the empire? That rhetoric is going to shift later towards, it really does make more sense for national self-determination since you're all racially German, like the Anschluss is the thing that should happen. So like the US is very comfortable with the Anschluss by the time that it happens, but they're not immediately at that position, kind of either with the armistice or with the treaty in 1921.
Thank you, Nicole. And Gunda put in the chat the comment, the Austrians themselves did not believe in a new state. So just to close this session. Nicole, thank you so much for a great Q&A session as well as a great lecture. We will have now 2 consecutive shorter lectures of 30 minutes each by Professor Becker and Professor Bart Skalmani, Austrian Voices. Professor Becker is a professor of history at the University of Vienna with a focus on Austrian history and the history of the 19th and 20th centuries. One of his research areas is decision-making in a modern state, the Habsburg monarchy from a comparative perspective. And the title of Professor Becker's talk will be A Treaty Fraught with Salvation. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I will not immediately share my screen because the actually 1 or 2 slides that I would like to present are actually just in midst of the presentation. Sure, I'm going to share the screen by the time when it's necessary. This title reflects above all my bewilderment, which grew more and more when I looked closely